The German generals leaned over the huge map in the war room in Berlin. Little flags with tiny swastikas marked armored divisions, fleets, elite units. Reports from the Abwehr and the SD arrived in piles, stamped, organized, classified. Up above, at the top, the Führer made decisions, convinced he could see the whole chessboard of the war. But there was something they didn't know, something that never appeared in any memo. A large part of what they trusted blindly was, in practice, written, filtered, and manipulated by their enemies. Without ever setting foot in Hitler's bunker, the Allies were, little by little, infiltrating the Nazi high command in the one place the dictatorship believed itself invulnerable: information. World War II, tanks, planes, infantry divisions, those are the images we usually remember. But behind every offensive, there was something less visible and just as lethal: the secret war of intelligence. On one side, the Third Reich, with its Abwehr, its security service, SD, its almost religious faith in the Enigma cipher machine. On the other side, the British, Americans, Poles, French, all trying to answer the same question: how to penetrate the brain of the Nazi war machine. According to historical records, Hitler and his inner circle believed Enigma was unbreakable. Encoded reports traveled up and down the chain of command, from the front to the top, surrounded by an aura of technical infallibility. What they didn't imagine was that the first crack in this wall did not come from a spy in disguise in Berlin, but from mathematicians sitting in discrete rooms hundreds of kilometers away. Meanwhile, long before the classic scenes of Bletchley Park that usually appear in documentaries, another quiet intelligence center had already triggered the crisis that would put Nazi invincibility in doubt. In the early 1930s, Poland lived under the shadow of Germany. Among its many military concerns, one stood out: breaking German communications. To do that, the Polish Cipher Bureau, the Bureau Cyfrów, recruited mathematicians instead of just linguists, a decision which, according to historians of cryptography, would change the course of the war. Among these young men was Marian Rejewski, a brilliant mathematician. Using advanced algebraic methods, he and his colleagues reconstructed the internal workings of the German military Enigma from intercepted messages and from a commercial machine obtained through French intelligence. It was not a cinematic cloak and dagger coup, but in a certain sense it was even bolder. They infiltrated the enemy's mind by understanding the logic of the machine, in which the Reich placed most of its trust. On paper, Rejewski had entered the nervous system of the German armed forces. According to historical records, in July 1939, with war approaching, the Poles invited British and French representatives to a secret meeting near Warsaw. There, they revealed what they had done. They showed their replicas of Enigma and shared their code-breaking methods. They handed the British and the French the equivalent of a master key to Hitler's vault of secrets. In terms of infiltration, it was as if they had opened a window into what passed across the desks of the German High Command, even though that window, at the beginning of the war, was narrow and required huge effort to keep open. The United Kingdom built its intelligence fortress in a seemingly banal place, an old brick manor house in the countryside known as Bletchley Park. There, military personnel, mathematicians, linguists, logic specialists, and an army of female operators and analysts came together to take on Enigma. The real scene, according to photos, reports, and memoirs, was less glamorous than later myths suggest. Wooden huts, long tables piled with papers, electromechanical bomba machines spinning without rest, cigarettes, mugs of tea, dark circles under tired eyes. Among the best-known names today is Alan Turing, a Cambridge mathematician who played a crucial role in developing machines that could automate parts of the cipher-breaking process. But what really matters for our story is not the isolated individual, and yes, what Bletchley Park became, a vantage point inside the flow of orders, fears, illusions, and expectations of the Nazi high command. When a German encrypted message was intercepted by Allied radio stations and sent to Bletchley, a race against time began. If deciphered, often in just a few hours, that message could reveal what German generals had just decided, or what they were about to do. Here, infiltration takes on an almost paradoxical shape. Without putting a single agent in Hitler's Situation Room, the Allies, through signals intelligence, began to read a significant part of the Reich's internal conversations. According to historical records, the material derived from code breaking received the code name Ultra. Only a very restricted circle had access to these reports. They showed, for example, attack plans, troop movement orders, U-boat logistics in the Atlantic. At a table in London, British officers read decisions that had been taken hours earlier in Berlin. In some cases, they knew about German changes of plan before all the units in the German army itself had been informed. It was not just espionage, it was the creation of a kind of internal mirror of the enemy's command machine. But listening is one thing, talking to the enemy and making him believe the idea is something very different. For a high command system to function, there has to be trust, and the Third Reich had too much trust in the wrong things. Hitler distrusted almost everyone, but trusted deeply in a few pillars: the supposed inviolability of Enigma, the effectiveness of German intelligence services, and of course his own quasi-mystical intuition. This mix created an environment where bad news was often softened, convenient information was promoted, and reports that confirmed what the Führer wanted to hear had the best chance of going up the ladder. According to studies of the Nazi command structure, the rivalry between the Abwehr military intelligence, headed by Wilhelm Canaris, and the Sicherheitsdienst (SD), linked to the SS, created internal feuds, prestige disputes, and even bureaucratic sabotage. Anyone wanting to influence the German high command did not just need to deceive, they needed to know exactly which gap in this confusion to push the right information through. Meanwhile, on the other side of the English Channel, a small group in London began organizing what would become one of the most systematic deception operations in all military history. At the beginning of the war, the British security services were rightly afraid of a Nazi fifth column. There were suspicions of German spies spread across the island, ready to help in an invasion. Over the course of 1940 and 1941, however, something surprising happened. According to official British records, practically all agents sent by the Abwehr to the United Kingdom were discovered, arrested, or killed. Some were amateurs, others made gross mistakes. Many were captured as soon as they parachuted in, or landed covertly. That was when a bold idea emerged. Instead of simply neutralizing these agents, why not use them? The ETSEX committee was formed, the Double Cross Committee, under the leadership of J.C. Masterman. Its mission to turn captured German spies into double agents, or when that was not possible, to manufacture fictitious identities and networks that would look real in the eyes of the Abwehr. The name Double Cross was not just a pun, it was a statement of method. If the Germans wanted to believe they had eyes and ears in London, the British were willing to hand them exactly that, under total British control. According to later accounts, this network of double agents grew to the point where, at a certain moment in the war, practically all the intelligence the Abwehr believed it was receiving from the United Kingdom was in reality being written in British offices. Infiltration was no longer just passive reading what the enemy said, it became active. London began writing short paragraphs, reports, and briefings that, after many stamps, summaries, and retransmissions, ended up on the desks of officers in Berlin. It was an invisible hand inside the flow of information in the Reich. Among the many characters in this war of deception, one became a symbol of how far the Allies managed to infiltrate German perceptions. Juan Pujol Garcia, known by the code name Garbo, Pujol was Spanish, with no formal training in espionage, but with one conviction: he wanted to damage the Nazi war effort. According to historical records, he first tried to offer his services to the British, and was turned down. He then approached the Germans, who accepted his proposal to spy on behalf of the Reich. He began providing the Germans with carefully fabricated reports built from public information and trivial observations, but presented in the style and format of a serious intelligence report. From Lisbon, he built on paper an entire network of fictitious sub-agents supposedly spread across the United Kingdom. The Germans believed him, they paid him, sent him instructions, praised his initiative. From the Abwehr's point of view, they had found a rare agent, dedicated, with access to a supposedly wide network, apparently ideologically motivated. Later, when the British finally agreed to work with Pujol, he began operating under MI5's control. From then on, his reports became a direct tool of the Allied deception system. The crucial detail is this: Garbo's reports did not end in some minor office. According to documents analyzed after the war, the German High Command considered his information extremely reliable. Some of his reports literally ended up on the desks of generals planning the defense of occupied Europe. In other words, a Spaniard improvised into a spy was by means of telegrams and intermediaries, inserting phrases, maps, and numbers into the strategic thought process of the Wehrmacht. No disguise, no uniform, no fake passport for Germany. The infiltration was done from a distance, with pen, paper, radio, and credulity on the other side. To grasp the scale of this infiltration, you need to follow the path of a single piece of information. Imagine a report from Garbo or another double agent. It is written, often in code, and sent by radio or letter to an intermediate Abwehr station, for example in Lisbon or Madrid. Local analysts decode it, evaluate it, and add comments. The parts considered relevant are resent as a priority to departments in Berlin. In Berlin, this data is cross-checked with other reports, including intercepts, aerial observations, and rumors coming from diplomats. Syntheses are then produced for the General Staff, for the OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the Armed Forces High Command, and in some cases for Hitler. In that process, a seemingly banal detail, such as there are signs of troop concentration in Region X, could, if it matched what the High Command already feared or expected, gain enormous weight. It became confirmed by reliable sources. Meanwhile, in London, the XX committee eagerly monitored the feedback. Messages deciphered by ULTRA showed how the Germans reacted to reports that ultimately had been written by the British themselves. It was a closed circuit of controlled disinformation. London fed Berlin, Bletchley Park read Berlin's replies. The XX committee then adjusted the narrative to reinforce certainties and illusions. In practical terms, this meant that when deciding where to position panzer divisions or which ports to reinforce, the Nazi High Command was taking into account data that came largely from agents it believed it controlled, but who were in fact puppets of the British. Infiltrating the High Command, in this context, was not about sitting in the chair next to Hitler. It was something colder, and in a way, more disturbing. It was interfering with what he read before making decisions. In 1943, Winston Churchill is reported to have said in a confidential context a phrase that would become famous: in wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. The phrase, widely cited in studies of World War II, reflects the doctrine that was taking shape on the Allied side. It was not enough to hide the truth. It was necessary to systematically manufacture alternative versions of reality for the enemy to consume. This bodyguard of lies was deployed at several levels. Word reports from double agents such as Garbo, Trixical, and others. Radio operations deceiving German stations. Fake conversations staged to be picked up by enemy listening posts, and even corpses with forged documents prepared to be found. But that part was still to come.
At that point, no one knew how far it would be possible to push this logic. Was there a limit? How many lies could the Nazi high command swallow before growing suspicious? Or would the authoritarian structure itself, full of internal rivalries, help swallow everything? Meanwhile, the Ultra machines kept revealing the effects of the forgeries. It was nearly a real-time experiment. The Allies could see, from the inside, how far they were reprogramming the enemy's perception. In 1942 and 1943, the Mediterranean was a contested chessboard. The North African campaign was moving toward an unfavorable outcome for the Axis. Rommel, the Desert Fox, was under pressure. The Allies were planning their next steps: Sicily, Greece, Sardinia, where to land to open the soft underbelly of Europe, as Churchill put it. The Nazi high command was also trying to answer that question. According to documents analyzed after the war, there were intense debates about which region was the most likely target of an Allied landing. Italy was vulnerable, but the Axis also considered the Balkans crucial, both for strategic and political reasons. It was the perfect moment for infiltration through deception. The enemy desperately needed information. And when someone is desperate, they tend to believe more easily what they want to be true. With the North African campaign nearing its end, the Allies began preparing what would become one of the most famous deception operations in history. A complex plot built around a single body, some carefully forged papers, and German faith in its own intelligence processes. Before getting to the corpse that would fool the Reich, it is important to understand what was at stake. This was not an isolated trick, but the high point of a strategy that brought together eavesdropping on high command signals via U-Ultra, systematic manipulation of the German spy network via double-cross, and deep understanding of how the enemy thought. In other words, an infiltration not carried out with silencers, but with a profound knowledge of how the bureaucratic and mental machine of the Third Reich worked. Contrary to the simplified image of intelligence geniuses on one side and gullible idiots on the other, reality was more complex. In the Nazi structure, there were experienced professionals, skeptics, people trained precisely to distrust rumors, and even so, they were deceived on a massive scale. According to later analyses by military historians and intelligence specialists, three main factors helped Allied infiltration into the Nazi high command: confirmation of expectations. Many Allied lies were built not to shock, but to confirm existing inclinations. If the high command already feared, for example, a landing in Greece, it was enough for reliable reports to point in that direction. The lie came wrapped in the format of a prior hypothesis: overconfidence in certain channels. The Germans classified their sources by reliability. When an agent such as Garbo was considered highly reliable, his reports carried disproportionate weight. The Allies who read these classifications via U-Ultra could dose carefully what he said, knowing it would resonate at the highest level. Internal disorganization and fear. In an authoritarian regime, bringing bad news or disagreeing with the leader's interpretation is risky. Information that contradicts the official view tends to be minimized. This environment made it easier to accept reports that fit what Hitler and his main generals wanted to believe. So infiltration was not just technical, it was psychological. By knowing the enemy well, their fears, prejudices, quirks, and internal rival, the Allies turned the Nazi intelligence system itself into a kind of conductor of deception. It was as if the generals in Berlin had voluntarily opened a door in their mental fortress, believing they were simply looking through the most modern telescope in the world. They didn't realize the telescope's lenses had been carefully polished by enemy hands. In the spring of 1943, a body washed ashore near Huelva in Spain. It was dressed in the uniform of a British officer, with identity papers, personal letters, official documents. Among these papers was something that seemed to have incalculable value: secret plans for a future Allied invasion of southern Europe. Spain, officially neutral, had within its structures people sympathetic to the Axis, and German intelligence operated there with interest. It didn't take long for the documents to reach the hands of agents who then saw to it that copies arrived in Berlin. What the Allies had planted deliberately now began to climb the rungs of the Nazi intelligence analysis machine. According to historical records, there were internal debates in Germany about how far to trust these documents, but in a context of uncertainty and fear of landings, the temptation to accept those revelations was strong. Cross-checked with other signals, including reports from double agents, the evidence began to look coherent. At the time, no one in Berlin imagined that the body was part of a meticulously planned British operation later known as Operation Mincemeat. Still less did they imagine that in addition to calculating where the corpse would be found and who would have access to it, Allied intelligence would also be able to read via U-Ultra how the Germans reacted. It was the peak of infiltration through deception. The enemy not only accepted a fabricated version of reality, but pushed it all the way to the top, to the high command. What happened next shocked both sides, because the impact was greater than many planners had dared to hope. But that part of the story, and the way a single body helped avert entire Axis divisions, opens a new chapter in the secret war between truth and lies. That is exactly where our story dives next. The report reached Berlin like so many others inside an official envelope, accompanied by analyses, comments, stamps. At its origin, however, there was no German colonel, no neutral diplomat, no veteran Reich agent. There was a corpse thrown into the sea by a British submarine, carrying in its pocket carefully forged documents. When those papers moved through the desks of the Abwehr, the OKW, and finally reached Hitler's awareness, what seemed like just another piece of intelligence turned into something bigger, proof in the eyes of the Nazi high command that its strategic view was correct. They felt informed. In reality, they were being led. Spring 1943. With North Africa practically lost for the Axis, the big military mystery of the moment was where would the Allies strike next. Sicily seemed the obvious candidate. Precisely for that reason, it needed to stop looking like it. According to historical records, it was within the XX Committee and British Naval Inter-Region Naval Intelligence that the idea for something almost absurd emerged: to plant in territory accessible to the Axis a body with top-secret documents suggesting that the main target would not be Sicily, but Greece and Sardinia. The operation was given a code name that is famous today: Mincemeat. Behind the plan were figures such as Ewan Montague from Naval Intelligence and Charles Cholmondeley, linked to the double-cross system. They needed to solve three problems: obtain a body in plausible condition, build a completely convincing identity, ensure it fell into the right hands, and that the Germans believed the documents. The body came from a man of humble origins, Glyndwr Michael, who died in London in 1943, probably the victim of accidental phosphorus poisoning from rat poison. With no relatives to claim him, he ended up, in the brutal logic of war, available for the operation. He was turned into Major William Martin, Royal Marines, a supposed British officer on a sensitive mission. To bring Martin to life, British intelligence created an entire biography: love letters from a fiancé, overdue bills, theater ticket stubs, personal photos, small realistic inconsistencies, everything a living person might carry. The heart of the ruse, however, lay in a set of official papers, letters between senior British officers, suggesting that the main landing would be in Greece, with supporting actions in Sardinia, while Sicily would merely be a diversion. In other words, a carefully distorted version of the real Allied plans.
Meanwhile, the British submarine HMS Seraph prepared for the delivery. In April 1943, The body of Major Martin was released into the sea near the coast of Huelva in Spain, a location chosen very deliberately. The region was known for having local authorities and officers sympathetic to the Axis. The discovery of the body was almost guaranteed, and so was the interest of German intelligence. Shortly afterward, fishermen found the corpse. The Spanish bureaucratic machine went into action: autopsy, registration, seizure of documents, notifications. German agents, alert, approached discreetly. According to later records, they managed to access the papers, take copies, and send the content urgently to Berlin. On the German side, no one knew that in London, another group anxiously awaited a single question: had the Germans taken the bait? The British had been obsessively careful. After the documents were returned by the Spanish government, British intelligence examined the papers and envelopes under magnification. There were signs that they had been opened and handled. The theater had worked. Some analyst in some German office was now reading exactly what Montague and his colleagues wanted him to read. When Major Martin's documents reached Berlin, they were not received with blind naivety. According to historical research, there was discussion in the Abwehr and in the High Command about treating the material as too good to be true. But the old trap of confirming expectations kicked in. Hitler had long harbored a deep fear of attacks on Greece and the Balkans, a region he considered vital for control of Romanian oil and the stability of Europe's southern flank. In essence, the documents put on paper, with British letterheads, something that already circulated as a hypothesis in German strategic thinking. The papers were quickly cross-checked with other information, agent reports, intercepts, even assessments of Allied ship movements, together with other deception operations underway in the Mediterranean, such as Operation Barclay, which suggested a concentration of Allied forces against Greece. The narrative gained weight. The result was not a sudden overnight turnaround, but a series of very concrete decisions: reinforcement of German and Italian garrisons in Greece, greater focus on the Balkans in OKW reports, the redeployment of some Axis units to that region rather than to Sicily. According to post-war records, even Field Marshal Kesselring, responsible for Mediterranean defense, was influenced by the evidence arriving. Hitler, informed, reinforced his belief that Sicily might be a secondary target. When Operation Husky, the real Allied landing in Sicily, began in July 1943, the island was defended, but not as strongly as it could have been. Troops and resources that might have been sent there had been scattered among other threatened areas. What happened next shocked both sides. The Allies knew mincemeat had worked, but not how much. After the war, when they saw the German documents, they realized the deception had been taken quite seriously at the top of the chain of command. Confidence in the intelligence obtained reinforced a pattern that would become even more dangerous for the Reich. The belief on the part of the High Command that it was managing to anticipate Allied plans. In reality, it was reading a rigged script. If mincemeat was a brilliant one-off act, the Allies were about to turn deception into permanent theater. As the war advanced, a conviction grew in London. Germany would not be defeated only by conventional military pressure, but also by the erosion of its ability to decide correctly. It was necessary to hit not only the Reich's armies, but also the way the Reich thought. That's how, before the Great Landing in France, a broad deception strategy took shape, named Operation Bodyguard. The name itself seems to echo Churchill's idea that truth must be guarded by a bodyguard of lies. Bodyguard had exactly that function, to protect the truth about the location and date of the invasion of occupied Europe through a coordinated series of fake plans, rumors, and signals aimed at the enemy. According to historical records, Bodyguard had three main objectives: convince the Germans that the main attack would come somewhere other than Normandy, especially the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel; keep them uncertain about the exact date of the invasion, even after the real landing began; sustain the idea that it was only a diversionary attack. To achieve this, the Allies mobilized practically every tool they had perfected since 1939. The Double Cross Committee's network of double agents controlled clandestine radio transmitters, fake units, and inflatable equipment, carefully staged troop movements, cross-planned leaks in neutral countries. Meanwhile, at Bletchley Park, Urtra would continue to read the German reaction, allowing constant adjustments to the grand staging. At the heart of Bodyguard were two complementary operations: Fortitude North and Fortitude South. Fortitude North aimed to feed fears that the Allies would attack Norway. To do this, fictitious British and American units were created, supposedly concentrated in Scotland. Radio traffic was choreographed to simulate preparations, and double agents reported to the Abwehr signs of a growing threat in that direction. This forced the Nazi High Command to keep a significant contingent of troops in Norway, troops that could have been used in France. The main blow, however, was Fortitude South. Fortitude South virtually invented an entire army, the first U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, supposedly under the command of General George Patton, a figure whom Hitler and many German officers considered one of the most aggressive and dangerous Allied commanders. In reality, no such full army was poised to attack the Pas-de-Calais, but the Allies built its fictitious presence with almost artistic care. Fake tent camps, visible from a distance, inflatable tanks, wooden trucks, fabric aircraft, all positioned to be spotted by aerial reconnaissance, intense radio traffic, with messages crafted to sound like the routine of a large army group, fake logistical plans, suggesting nearby ports as points of departure. At the same time, double agents controlled by London flooded their Abwehr contacts with a torrent of coherent details: unit names, supposed commanders, rumors in pubs, overheard conversations between officers. From Berlin's vantage point, the picture was striking. According to later testimonies of German officers, the Pas-de-Calais seemed, from a distance, the obvious choice for an Allied strike. It was the narrowest point of the Channel. Urtra was closer to industrial Germany. It shortened supply lines, and now it appeared, in multiple sources, as the focus of enemy preparation. Fortitude did not put a spy in Hitler's bunker. It did something more subtle. It built a plausible world that slowly crystallized on the maps of the High Command. If the whole of Bodyguard was a great theater, Juan Puel, Garbo, was perhaps its leading actor. For months, he had been building his reputation with the Abwehr, reporting detailed impressions of supposed troop movements in the United Kingdom. Many of his reports were deliberately late, describing something that had already happened, so as to seem accurate, but not fast enough to be tactically useful. This made him believable. People do not usually distrust someone who is sometimes a little late with the news. On the eve of D-Day, Garbo was given a critical role in the script. According to historical records, the British plan for him was as follows. Before the landing, he would send generic warnings about large preparations, without details that would enable an effective response, just enough to reinforce his image as someone in the know. At dawn on the 6th of June 1944, he would send an alert saying a major attack was about to occur, but late enough that the Germans would not be able to react in time. After the invasion in Normandy began, he would hammer the narrative that this was only a preliminary operation ahead of the main blow at the Pas-de-Calais. The plan was followed with almost theatrical precision. In the early hours of D-Day, Garbo sent messages warning of an imminent attack. According to later accounts, these reached their destination too late to alter that night's course. Even so,
His prediction would later be noted as correct, an investment in credibility for the next phase. When the Germans saw the landings underway in Normandy, confusion took over the High Command. Was this the main attack, or just a diversion? Garbo then began to saturate his German controllers with reports confirming that large units, including Patton's fictional Fusag, were still standing by to attack the Pas-de-Calais. Normandy, he said, was the opening act. The main act was yet to come. In Berlin, this narrative fell on fertile ground. Hitler already tended to believe that the Pas-de-Calais was the real target. Now, this conviction seemed backed by a highly reliable source. According to post-war studies, the consequence was dramatic. The German 15th Army, assigned to defend the Pas-de-Calais, remained in the region for weeks after D-Day, even as Allied forces fought to expand the beachhead in Normandy. These divisions, if quickly thrown in force against the Normandy beaches, could have inflicted even greater losses and, in the extreme, made consolidation of the invasion much harder. Instead, they waited for a phantom attack. Once again, infiltration was not a spy in the conference room, but in the documents and reports the generals had in front of them when they looked at the map and tried to guess the enemy's next move. While the theater of bodyguard and fortitude played out, Bletchley Park had an advantage few deception planners in history ever enjoyed: the ability to see the audience's reaction in real time. By deciphering communications from the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine, ultra-analysts could track how information supplied by double agents and other deception operations was absorbed, discussed, and retransmitted within the German system. According to historical records, this enabled fine-tuning. If a lie seemed to have been received skeptically, the narrative was reinforced with more evidence. If a German assumption emerged spontaneously, double agents were instructed to confirm that direction with new details. If a German unit began moving in a threatening way, other deception operations could be activated to try to divert it. This was unprecedented: the ability to enter the enemy's decision cycle, the process by which High Command observes, orients itself, decides, and acts, and to systematically distort it. An emblematic example, beyond mincemeat and fortitude, was the Battle of the Atlantic. Britain depended on supply convoys crossing the North Atlantic. Donitz's U-boats tried to strangle this lifeline. By breaking German naval codes, the Allies turned Donitz's command room into something partly transparent. They could often see where the wolf packs were heading, and could reroute convoys or send escorts and aircraft. But this transparency was carefully masked by plausible explanations. When a convoy luckily changed course and escaped a U-boat pack, this was rarely attributed to U-Ultra. In the official narrative, it was air patrols, casual sightings, last-minute changes. The goal was always the same: not to let the enemy realize its information flow was compromised. If the Germans suspected Enigma had been broken, they could radically change their systems, shutting the window that so much effort had opened. So the very way the Allies acted, even when well-informed, was an extension of the deception war. They had to pretend that certain victories came from bravery or luck when they actually came from the ability to listen to and manipulate what was happening at the highest levels of German command. It would be tempting to conclude that at some point in the war the Allies saw everything and controlled everything. The reality was harsher. At the end of 1944, when Germany seemed in clear retreat on the Western Front, the Nazi High Command prepared an unexpected counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the famous Battle of the Bulge. Betting on a stroke of luck, Hitler secretly concentrated forces, hoping to break Allied lines and split the Anglo-American armies. In several respects, this was the Reich's attempt at a strategic surprise of its own. According to historical records, the attack caught many Allied commanders off guard. Part of the German preparations escaped Ultra's full detection, and the Allies, too confident in certain indicators, were hit by a blow that had seemed unlikely at that stage. The offensive was eventually contained, largely due to German logistical limits and the fierce resistance of American and British units. But the episode reminded everyone that the intelligence war was far from a one-way street. Even so, many German decisions at that point, including the choice to stake everything on a risky plan like the Ardennes offensive, were made under the pressure of a reality already distorted by years of deception, cumulative losses, and misplaced trust. The structure of the Nazi high command, corroded by internal suspicions, the weight of Hitler's personality, and successive defeats, had become increasingly vulnerable to misreading the overall picture. The Allies merely accelerated this process by supplying, over the years, the raw material for those mistaken interpretations. After 1945, in interrogations, memoirs, and statements from German officers, a troubling realization began to surface at several crucial moments. The Reich's High Command had made decisions based on information that, in hindsight, seemed almost unreal. Generals tried to justify themselves by saying they had been deceived. In some cases this sounded like an excuse, in others it was simply true. According to post-war military historians, it is possible to identify some points where Allied deception had a direct impact at the highest decision level. The perception that Sicily would not be the main target in 1943, influenced by mincemeat and related operations. The prolonged belief that the Pas de Calais was the central point of the imminent 1944 invasion, and that Normandy was a sideshow. The need to keep large contingents in areas threatened by fictitious armies, stationing excess forces in Norway and the Balkans. This does not mean deception alone won the war. The USSR was fighting a colossal war in the East. American industry was producing on an unprecedented scale. The RAF and USAAEEEEEEE were bombing the Reich resistance movements in occupied countries, were undermining German power. But by entering the mind of the Nazi high command through information, the Allies gained something precious: time, space, and margin for error. At several moments, the fate of panzer divisions, armored units, and strategic reserves depended on a mental picture the Allies had actively helped to build. Behind all these operations, code names, and reports, there were real people with real fears. Net in Huelva, fishermen who knew nothing of geopolitics pulled from the sea, a body carrying in its pockets the fate of thousands of soldiers. Net in the stuffy rooms of Bletchley Park, young women and men worked through the night, trying to decipher messages, unable to tell even their own families what they were doing. Net in Berlin, German intelligence analysts, some of them skeptical, tried to build a coherent mosaic from fragments, unaware that part of those pieces was deliberately fake. Net in London, members of the XX committee debated whether it was worth sacrificing a convoy, a minor target, a small unit, in order to preserve the mask that hid Ultra or the double agent network. The war of deception also carried a moral cost. Letting people die so as not to raise suspicion that certain information was being read was a terrible decision, but one that was sometimes made. Protecting the secret of Ultra and the deception network meant, in some cases, not acting even when they knew danger was imminent. These dilemmas rarely appear on operation maps, but they followed many of the people in this story for the rest of their lives. Juan Pujol, for example, lived a relatively anonymous post-war life, bearing the weight of having been decorated by both sides. He received the Iron Cross from the Germans, and later the Order of the British Empire. None of these medals resolved the inner contradiction of having lied professionally for years, even in the service of a cause he believed to be just. When we speak of infiltrating the Nazi high command, the image that usually comes to mind is of a spy in disguise, sitting in a concrete walled room, listening to orders directly from Hitler's mouth. The reality, colder and more impressive, was different. Most of the time, the Allies did not need to insert physical bodies into the bunker. They inserted ideas. They placed documents on intermediate desks, reports in folders marked reliable, radio messages in channels the Abwehr swore it controlled. By breaking Enigma, building networks of double agents, throwing corpses into the sea with pocketfuls of papers, inventing inflatable armies and empty radio traffic, they shaped the reality perceived by the Reich's high command. When German generals leaned over their maps trying to guess where the Allies would attack, it wasn't just their military talent that mattered, it was the raw material their thinking was built on. And part of that raw material had been carefully tampered with. In the end, that is what made this infiltration so powerful. It did not just steal secrets, it supplied false secrets, turning the enemy into an involuntary accomplice in its own defeat. After the war, many of the files on Ultra, Double Cross, and operations such as Mincemeat stayed secret for decades. The public knew there had been espionage, code breakers, tricks, but the depth of the infiltration through deception only began to fully emerge in the second half of the 20th century, as documents were declassified and memoirs were published. According to modern intelligence studies, World War II became a brutal laboratory for techniques that are standard today. Strategic use of disinformation, building coherent narratives to manipulate enemy perception, controlling double agents as channels of influence, not just collection, integrating signals, intercepts with psychological operations. Between 1939 and 1945, the awareness took shape that a war is not won only by destroying what the enemy has, but also by corrupting how the enemy thinks. If we look today at grainy photos of Hitler's bunker with maps on the walls and telephones on the desks, it is hard not to imagine a silent scene. In some corner of the office, stacked up, are reports, telegrams, maps, and notes that were never truly German. They are, in fact, the distant voice of Bletchley Park, of ME5, of an unlikely Spaniard in London, of a dead man found on a Spanish beach. Without ever walking the corridors of the Reichschancellery, these men and women were invisibly present in many of the most important discussions held there. In the end, the phrase could be reversed. The Nazi high command was not infiltrated by people who entered its rooms. It was infiltrated by ideas they themselves allowed in. And those ideas, written in code, on letterhead paper, in supposedly secure reports, were a decisive part of the long fall of the Third Reich.